Right now, as I'm recording this, meteorologists are watching a ridge of high pressure over the Rockies, and planes get stronger by the hour. By tomorrow, Saturday, it is forecast to become the single most powerful heat dome anywhere on the planet at that moment. Not the strongest in Montana, not the strongest in the US, the strongest heat dome on Earth, sitting directly over American soil, and it hasn't even peaked yet. I need you to actually process that sentence because I know how numb we've all gotten to heat dome headlines this summer. This isn't hype. This is the National Weather Service and multiple independent forecast models agreeing that early next week, temperatures could surge past 110 degrees across a corridor running from the Dakotas down through Texas, with more than 30 states facing record-challenging heat before this pattern is done. And here's the part that should really grab you. This is not the first heat dome of the summer. It's not even the second or third. This is the fourth major one, and forecasters are calling it, straight up, the summer of the heat dome. One relentless pattern after another, each one arriving before the last one's damage has even been fully counted. So today, we're going to walk through exactly how we got here. Why this specific heat dome is forecast to be the strongest one yet. What the worst is still ahead. Actually means in hard numbers. And what you need to do if you're anywhere in its path over the next 7 to 10 days. Let's get into it. To understand why scientists are using words like unprecedented and the planet's strongest for what's building right now, you need the full timeline of this summer because this heat dome isn't an isolated event. It's the fourth link in a chain. It started in Europe back in May with a historic, record-shattering heat wave that pushed temperatures 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above normal and broke all-time spring heat records across multiple countries. That was followed by a second European wave in late June that pushed Spain and Portugal toward 44 degrees Celsius and broke the UK's all-time June record. Then the pattern crossed the Atlantic. In late June and early July, a slow-moving heat dome parked itself over the eastern two-thirds of the United States, right around the 4th of July holiday, with heat indices climbing to 105 to 115 degrees across a huge stretch of the country from Texas across the southeast to the east coast. Overnight lows in dense urban areas failed to drop below 75 or 80 degrees, which meant millions of people got zero real relief even after the sun went down. That heat dome forced grid operators to bypass certain environmental restrictions just to keep power plants running at full capacity during peak demand. After that one finally broke down, a third heat dome built over the Intermountain West in mid-July. This one hit the northern Rockies especially hard. The National Weather Service office in Salt Lake City called it the most significant heat wave of the season at that point, with Salt Lake City reaching 106 degrees, tying for the second highest temperature in that city's recorded history going back to 1874. Farther north, in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, temperatures reached 110 to 115 degrees, and numerous weather stations recorded their highest temperatures since record-keeping began in that region. NASA's own Earth Observatory team flagged that weekend, July 11th and 12th, as a genuinely historic stretch of heat for the northern Rockies. So that's 3 major heat domes before this one. Europe twice, the eastern US once, the northern Rockies once, and now, less than 2 weeks after that third event, a fourth heat dome is forming, and forecasters are telling us it's on track to be the strongest of the entire summer on the entire planet at the moment it peaks. Let's actually explain what a heat dome is and why meteorologists can rank one as stronger than another, because that phrase gets thrown around loosely and I want you to understand what it technically means. A heat dome forms when a large, slow-moving area of high pressure builds and essentially parks itself over a region. Under that high pressure, air sinks. As air sinks, it compresses, and compression heats it up, the same basic physics that makes a bicycle pump warm when you use it. That sinking, compressing air also suppresses clouds and rain, which means there's nothing blocking direct sunlight from baking the ground below day after day, with no storms coming through to interrupt the pattern or cool things down. When meteorologists talk about the strength of a heat dome, they're often referring to something measured in the upper atmosphere, roughly 3 miles up, using a metric of atmospheric pressure and temperature that lets forecasters compare ridges of high pressure against each other and against historical records, almost like comparing hurricanes by central pressure. A heat dome that ranks as the strongest on the planet at a given moment means the ridge sitting over that region has a more extreme combination of height and warmth in the upper atmosphere than any other high-pressure system anywhere else in the world at that same time. That's the technical bar this weekend's system is forecast to clear, and the reason this one is expected to produce such extreme surface temperatures isn't just the strength of the ridge itself, it's the geography underneath it. The core of this heat dome is forecast to sit over the plains and stretch down toward Texas, an area that, especially in the Dakotas and the central and southern plains, is already dealing with developing drought. Dry ground heats up faster and more intensely than moist ground. because moisture in soil normally absorbs a lot of incoming solar energy through evaporation instead of letting it directly heat the surface. Take that moisture away through drought, and nearly all of that solar energy goes straight into raising the ground and near-surface air temperature instead. That's part of why forecasters are specifically flagging the plains, rather than just naming a blanket, the whole country will be hot forecast. The combination of an unusually strong ridge and unusually dry ground underneath it is what's driving these specific 110 plus degree numbers. Here's how this is expected to unfold day by day, because I want you tracking this with a real mental map instead of just a vague sense that it's going to be hot. This weekend, Saturday and Sunday, the ridge strengthens over the Rockies and Central Plains. This is when it's forecast to peak as the strongest heat dome on the planet at that moment. Expect the first wave of daily record highs in Colorado, Wyoming, and the Central Rockies, building on top of ground that's already been baked by the mid-July event just 2 weeks earlier. Early next week, the pattern expands east and south. The core of the most extreme heat is forecast to shift into the plains, stretching from the Dakotas down through Texas, with temperatures surging past 110 degrees across that corridor. This is also when the heat is expected to push into the Gulf Coast, adding dangerous humidity to the mix, which means the heat index, what the air actually feels like on your skin, will run well above the raw air temperature in a lot of these areas. Through the middle of next week, expect this to keep expanding rather than contracting. Forecasters are describing this as a slow-moving extended pattern, not a brief spike. That distinction matters medically as much as meteorologically. A one-day spike to 105 is dangerous. 5 or 6 consecutive days in the triple digits without a real overnight cooldown is a completely different level of cumulative physical stress on the human body, especially for people without reliable air conditioning, outdoor workers, and anyone with existing heart or respiratory conditions. And here's the honest caveat I want to give you, because good forecasting includes the uncertainty. Exactly how long this heat dome lingers into the following week is still not locked in. Some signals point toward it slowly weakening by the following weekend. Others suggest it could re-strengthen or shift rather than break down cleanly. I treat any specific "it ends on this exact date" claim you see online right now with some skepticism. The broad shape of this event, more than a week of dangerous, record-challenging heat across the central U. S is solid. The exact final day is not yet nailed down. It's also worth understanding why forecasters are so confident about the broad shape of this event, even while the exact end date stays fuzzy. Slow-moving heat domes like this one are, in a strange way, some of the more predictable weather patterns meteorologists deal with precisely because they resist change. A fast-moving storm system can shift its track by 100 miles in a day and completely change who gets hit. A heat dome, almost by definition, is a pattern that's actively resisting exactly that kind of movement. It's parked, it's heavy, and it takes a genuinely significant shift in the broader jet stream pattern to dislodge it. That's good news for forecast confidence on the "this is going to be bad and it's going to last a while" question. And it's also exactly why these events end up doing so much cumulative damage. The same stubbornness that makes them predictable is what makes them dangerous. Compare that to how this year's earlier heat domes actually played out on the ground. The early July event over the eastern U.S. held on for the better part of a week before finally breaking down heading into the following weekend. The mid-July event over the northern Rockies behaved similarly, sizzling Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming for the better part of 5 or 6 days before easing. If this new heat dome follows a comparable pattern, and there's no strong reason right now to expect it to be shorter, we're looking at the plains and central U.S. dealing with dangerous, record-challenging heat well into the first days of August. Now, here's where I want to zoom all the way out, because the peak is still ahead isn't just a forecast statement about this one heat dome. Some of the scientists tracking this pattern are making a bigger claim about the whole summer and even the whole year. Climate researchers, including a briefing from Climate Central earlier this summer, have pointed out that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels peak seasonally each May, right before northern hemisphere forests go into full growing mode and start pulling carbon back out of the air for a few months. But human emissions are now outpacing what forests and oceans can absorb, which means the underlying warming trend keeps compounding year over year. And roughly 2/3 of all the excess carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere has accumulated in just the last 50 years. That's the slow-moving engine underneath every one of these individual heat domes. On top of that baseline trend, prominent climate scientists, including James Hansen, have specifically flagged 2026 as likely to become the planet's warmest year on record, despite the year actually starting out somewhat cooler than 2024, the previous record holder. The UK's Met Office has projected 2026 global temperatures landing around 46 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average, which would mark the 4th consecutive year above the 4 degree threshold. It puts the world uncomfortably close to the 1. 5-degree Paris Agreement target that was originally framed as a long-term ceiling, not a milestone we'd be brushing up against this soon. Here's why that context matters for a single heat dome forecast. When the baseline global temperature keeps climbing year after year, every individual heat dome that forms on top of that baseline has a higher floor to work from. That's part of why meteorologists aren't surprised to see 4 separate strongest of the season, or strongest on the planet, headlines stacking up within a single summer. It's not that the atmosphere is behaving randomly more dramatic, it's that the entire system is running warmer than it used to. So each new ridge of high pressure that forms has more energy available to work with than the same weather pattern would have had 10 or 20 years ago. Scientists studying attribution, the science of calculating how much more likely or intense a specific weather event was made by human-caused climate change, have already run this analysis on earlier heat domes this same summer. One rapid attribution study concluded that the combination of extreme heat and high humidity seen during the East Coast heat dome in early July would have been essentially impossible without greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels. I'd expect a similar study to eventually get run on this weekend's system once it's over, and given how it's already being described as the strongest heat dome of the summer, I would not be surprised if the attribution numbers come back even more stark. Let's get concrete about what dangerous heat actually does once it's on the ground, because these effects compound differently than most people expect. On the health side, heat is already the deadliest weather-related hazard in the United States, ahead of hurricanes, tornadoes, and flooding combined in most recent years. The CDC's own data shows heat-related deaths have more than doubled since 1999, with 2,325 reported in 2023 alone. And this pattern specifically raises the risk in a way that's easy to underestimate. After 3 previous heat domes already this summer, a lot of people, buildings, and even soil and vegetation are still carrying residual stress from the earlier events. Bodies that have already been through repeated heat exposure this summer, particularly older adults, outdoor workers, and anyone with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions, don't get a full reset just because there were a few cooler days in between waves. That's part of why cumulative heat exposure across a summer like this one is genuinely more dangerous than the same total number of hot days spread out evenly. It's worth knowing the difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke, because that distinction can change what you do in the moment. Heat exhaustion typically shows up as heavy sweating, weakness, dizziness, nausea, and a headache. The body is struggling but still cooling itself. The response there is to get the person into shade or air conditioning, have them drink water and cool their skin with a damp cloth. Heat stroke is a different emergency entirely. It happens when the body's cooling system fails outright, and it often presents with hot, dry, or flushed skin, confusion, slurred speech, or loss of consciousness. Heat stroke is a call emergency services immediately situation, not a give them some water and wait situation, because body temperature can climb to dangerous levels within minutes once the sweating response shuts down. On the power grid side, we already saw what happened during the early July event, when demand got high enough that authorities had to bypass normal environmental restrictions on power plants just to keep the lights and air conditioning running. With this new heat dome forecast to push into more than 30 states, expect similar strain, particularly across the plains and into Texas, where grid demand during extreme heat has been a recurring vulnerability in recent summers. And on the wildfire side, the situation is genuinely more complicated than hotter equals worse fires would suggest. Wildfires have already burned more than 3 million acres across the U.S. this year, well above the historical average. And this new heat dome is expected to further dry out vegetation and soil across the plains and into drought-affected areas. But meteorologists have been honest that what this specific heat dome means for wildfire activity isn't fully clear-cut, since fire spread also depends heavily on wind patterns and existing fuel conditions that vary a lot by exact location. What is clear is that the drought expansion forecasters are projecting through mid-August, especially worsening in Kansas and Nebraska, sets the stage for elevated fire risk even after this particular heat dome eventually breaks down. If you're anywhere from the Rockies, through the plains and down into Texas and the Gulf Coast over the next week to 10 days, here's what I want you to actually act on. First, take the multi-day nature of this seriously. This isn't a single bad afternoon you can just push through. Plan your week around it. Move any strenuous outdoor activity, yard work, exercise, construction, farm labor, to the earliest part of the morning before the sun has had time to build real intensity, and treat the afternoon window as off limits for anything physically demanding. Second, focus specifically on overnight relief, because this is the detail that catches people off guard. When overnight lows stay elevated night after night, your body never gets the recovery window it needs, even if you're managing the daytime heat fine. If your home doesn't have reliable air conditioning, identify a cooling center, a friend or family member's home, or a public space like a library or mall where you can spend at least a few hours during the hottest stretch of each day, especially if this drags on for the full week plus that's currently forecast. Third, check on the people in your life who are actually at elevated risk. Older relatives, neighbors living alone, anyone with a chronic heart or lung condition, and outdoor workers you know personally. A short phone call or a text checking in genuinely catches problems early before someone ends up in real medical danger from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Fourth, if you're in an area under drought stress specifically, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, and the broader Plains corridor, be aware that this heat dome is very likely to deepen that drought further, which has real implications beyond just discomfort. Agricultural stress, water restrictions, and elevated fire risk that can persist well after the heat itself finally breaks. And fifth, don't assume this is the last heat dome of the summer just because it's forecast to be the strongest one. Given that we're already on number 4, and given that climate scientists are flagging 2026 as a likely record warm year overall, I would build your general summer planning around the expectation that more of these events are coming, not around the hope that this is the finale. One more practical note, specifically for anyone in the drought-affected plains states. This is also a reasonable moment to check your home's cooling system before the peak of the heat actually arrives, not during it. HVAC service calls spike hard once a heat dome is already in full swing and appointment availability drops accordingly. If your air conditioning has been making an odd noise or struggling to keep up during the earlier heat waves this summer, getting it looked at now, before Sunday or Monday, puts you in a much better position than waiting until it fails on the hottest day of the stretch. So here's where this stands as of today, July 25th. A fourth major heat dome of the summer is strengthening over the Rockies and Plains this weekend, forecast to become the strongest heat dome anywhere on the planet at its peak, with temperatures surging past 110 degrees from the Dakotas down through Texas early next week, and more than 30 states facing record-challenging heat before this pattern finally breaks down. It's arriving on top of 3 previous major heat domes this summer in a year that climate scientists already expect to land as one of the warmest, if not the warmest, ever recorded. Over the next week, I'll be watching 3 things. Whether this heat dome actually claims the strongest of the summer title once it fully peaks, how far the drought and fire risk deepens across the plains as a result, and whether the pattern breaks down cleanly by next weekend or instead re-strengthens into a 5th event. That's not a comfortable thing to say out loud, but I'd rather tell you the honest range of possibilities than a false all clear. If breakdowns like this help you actually plan around the weather instead of just reacting to it, subscribe, because I'll have the update the moment this pattern shifts in either direction. I'll see you in the next one.